Governance specialist Judith February says the tussle between ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa, the party's suspended Secretary General Ace Magashule, and their respective factions are a distraction for the governing ANC. She says the effects of this distraction are seen in the overall neglect, mediocrity, as well as presidential indecision in government. February says the country has to keep the economy afloat. The government has to somehow develop the capability to vaccinate millions of people at the same time. Now, as if that's not enough, South Africa has to minimize the effect of load shedding while ensuring that a full-blown public service strike is averted. Lawyer, governance specialist and columnist Judith February joins us to discuss these issues. Judith, great to see you. Welcome.
Good morning, Leanne. It's lovely to be here.
So I know that you've been writing a couple of opinion pieces, and let's talk about some of them. In one of your opinion pieces, you touch on many things: Jacob Zuma's trial, vaccines, Magashule, wage negotiations, pretty much so everything I've said in the introduction. And you say that the ANC's internal fighting is causing a distraction, which results in neglect, mediocrity, and presidential indecision in government. So that is what, in a nutshell, you have said. Talk to us a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Leanne. So, well, part of what I was asking was the question whether the centre would hold. And that, as you know, is from the William Yeats poem, The Second Coming. And it was a quote which a poem which Thabo Mbeki, former president, liked to quote at the opening of Parliament and so on. And one always wondered when he was talking about that whether he meant the centre of the ANC or indeed the country's centre. And so part of what I was saying in the piece was asking that question: is the centre holding? There one could argue that we are very close to that centre collapsing in a sense. And what I do say in the piece, which is actually, it's a newsletter that I write every second week on legal and political matters for the Daily Maverick. And what I was asking there was just looking at what was happening within the ANC, and then sort of drawing the parallels to saying that if the centre of the ANC is not holding as the governing party, well, then the rest of society does have problems. And some people would be critical of that view because it's too ANC-centric. But it does matter if the ANC is distracted. As I said, it's the governing party. And so if you have a party which is tearing itself apart because of internal divisions, then it automatically spills over into government. And we've seen that in the president's cabinet. We've seen that on a host of issues over the past years. And this is not new. Thabo Mbeki was asking it during his presidency. But of course, the factional battles are obviously out in the open now. And Thabo Mbeki had a great hold over the ANC as a party, which is not quite the case with President Ramaphosa right now.
Yeah. I mean, let's pick up on that quote that you use, that former President Thabo Mbeki did quote, "Will the centre hold?" And I ask that question now: will the centre hold? Because at the end of the day, it is very difficult to remove the ANC political infighting or whatever may be going within the ranks of the ANC from South Africa, because at the end of the day, the two are completely intertwined. Will that centre hold if, as you say, President Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't seem to be holding that power?
It's very difficult. I think we're in a tenuous moment. Of course, these things, in a sense, because we follow the daily politics like a boxing match. You know, today's Ace Magashule's day, tomorrow's Ramaphosa's day. I think the stepping aside ruling was an important one in terms of President Ramaphosa consolidating some of his power, particularly ahead of the local government elections, and those will be important in terms of putting the face of President Ramaphosa out there and trying to show that the ANC is serious about dealing with issues of corruption. Now, you know, one can have a separate conversation about whether that is the case or not. But certainly it is a sort of jellyfish centre at the moment. And as ever in South Africa, we are at a precipice. The social and economic degradation, the social degradation division that we see, Leanne, all around us, I mean, that is a symptom of a governing party which has lost its way. And so how we claw back after also the wasted 9 years of state capture, and we just a cursory look at what is happening at the Zondo Commission, and we can see the billions of rands that have been looted from the state in a concerted, planned effort to loot the state by a network of individuals linked to the former President Zuma. And so how one claws one's way back is very difficult, and how you rebuild institutions is a complex and very slow task. In the meantime, you have to keep that center holding. And so we are in a place which is precarious, because you also have deep levels of inequality, you have high levels of unemployment, you have people, and we've seen the COVID-19 pandemic has laid all of this bare. You've seen a mixture of weak institutions, but also desperation amongst the majority of citizens in our country. I mean, if you look at the desperation of people queuing for a 350 Rand TERS grant, that is a sad indictment on the government of the day and on previous governments to not deal with problems of endemic poverty, and not to deliver to those in our society who are most marginalized. And so that mix, South Africa always on the edge, always at 2 minutes to midnight. We need to start pulling ourselves back from that precipice, and that means the slow, hard work of rebuilding institutions and rebuilding our democracy.
Yeah, I want to talk about and look into our history of unaccountability in South Africa. And I mean, let's take a fresh example that has happened right now. You look at media reports that are coming out. I mean, it's nothing new. It's something that has been rambling, speaking about our health minister being involved in, irregular activities, 150 million Rand that has been sort of moving between bank accounts, which is questionable. 20 million Rand, there's still no track of it. But I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of that. Peter Louis Myburg, we spoke to him a little bit earlier. But many people waking up and saying, in another country, if a health minister was even suspected of doing something along these lines, he would either A, step aside, or he would be immediately asked to step down, saying, look, let's investigate, let's see what's going on. I mean, we have a look at what happened in Zambia, one of our neighboring countries, that the health minister there was fired for doing irregular things. Now, I'm just bringing up the health minister because this is now something that is topical we're talking about. But we see the culture of unaccountability in South Africa, where people just continue and plead ignorance to, not knowing what happened. We didn't know this was going on, no idea what's happening. These are the kind of responses we get all the time. Where did this come from? I mean, let's try and look back into our history. Is it due to something like apartheid? Perhaps there was not enough accountability there?
Well, Leanne, we can look back, and it's almost, I mean, in the Anki Krok, we're doing poetry now, but in her poem, she talked Country of Grief and Grace. She talks about if the old does not confess, the new carry on in a similar vein. I'm paraphrasing now, but it's a deep point. And I think it applies to all levels of our society. Why are we such a violent society, for example? And one can go back into history. But if one looks at post-apartheid South Africa, we have this, and it's wonderful. We're celebrating 25 years of the Constitution this year, and and particularly this month. And it's an important moment to look back, to think of what we were trying to do. What we were trying to do was make a clean break with that past. And the founding provisions of the Constitution in Section 1, it talks about an accountable government and a transparent and open government. And that's what you were trying to build. Because, of course, there has been a strain of authoritarianism, a strain of a lack of accountability. The entire apartheid system was about not being accountable. So what we tried to do in 1994 was something new. And here we have this wonderful constitution where we also have Chapter 9 institutions, which are those institutions which protect and defend democracy and are supposed to create greater accountability. Parliament, the judiciary, and so on. So that's the machinery that you have that you can work within. And but it's aspirational because, of course, all institutions depend on on individuals to populate them. And if you have individuals who are corrupt, then you will not get that accountability. And of course, these things are intrinsically linked because the ANC, being the governing party, will populate these institutions. And if it is falling apart, and if it has ethical breaches, and if its centre isn't holding, and so on, as Kgalema Motlanthe said as far back as 2005, I think it was, the cancer of corruption is eating away at this party. So these are not new things, but I think we reach the high point with state capture, where it's a simple, untrammeled looting of the state. Yeah. It's a project, right? And so, but you ask about the history. So, I mean, the first piece of work I did when I started working at the Institute for Democracy was looking at the arms deal. That was a multi-billion rand deal. And that is where accountability mechanisms fell by the wayside. There was, I mean, we can go into it, but there was a cover-up at every level, at Parliament and so on. And then our institutions started to be manipulated because you had a ruling party which didn't want to, and a president who didn't really want all of this to be out in the open. It was a sad time for South Africa, and really a moment where we could have said we're taking a stand for accountability and for transparency, and we will have a proper investigation of this deal. But instead, there were ministers who came to Parliament, I remember the day well, who essentially who shut down that investigation. Then Speaker of Parliament, Freni Ginwala, was happy to do the executive's bidding and to shut down that investigation. People like Andrew Feinstein and Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, Gavin Woods, they were ostracized. Vincent Smith, who's now involved in his own corruption allegations, was then made head of the Public Accounts Committee. So one can see that, when you had a moment where you could deal with grand corruption, that moment we failed at that point. Yeah. And so what happens after that is you simply have a continuous stream of corruption allegations. But Leanne, also to your point about Minister Mkhize, it's important, I think, to note that the president has it's his prerogative who he wants to appoint in his cabinet. So, of course, he should ask the Minister of Health to step aside, to use the ANC words, or be vacating his duty, at least while these allegations are being investigated. There seems to be complete silence about them, and that is not acceptable. So, but again, these are about alliances, and they're about varying factions of the ANC, and that the president needs to keep those who support him closest. And so it would be inconvenient.
I suppose they'll come up and say, well, it's not before a court of law. These are just allegations at the moment. So, these are the kind of reasons we get used to. Yes. I just want to ask you very quickly, we need to start rounding off the conversation. So we talked to all of these issues that the ruling party is going through, asking about the centre of power, talking about infighting factions, all of these things that we hear about, looting from the state. And yet, let's cast our mind back to by-elections that we recently saw. And the ANC coming out really, really strong in these by-elections, bar something like the Patriotic Alliance, who we saw doing pretty well in wards like El Dorado Park, and the DA losing wards. And I suppose that's a conversation on itself. But just because we're talking at the ANC level, the voter still putting their mark next to the party. So what is in the psyche of the voter? If we're seeing all of this corruption happening, and yet South Africans are still voting for this party, what is going on?
Well, Leanne, there are historical reasons for that, but also a failure of the opposition to capitalise, I think, on the failings of the ANC, and also to create a an alternative, which is an alternative which is more reflective of South Africa. And yes, the DA and opposition politics is another conversation. But we've seen the DA in the last week and the last months simply imploding. And I don't think it will be very interesting to see what the local government elections throw up. I do think, though, that at the last local government elections and certainly at the previous national elections, voters did show an appetite to leave the ANC. I think we must be careful not to draw too many conclusions, decisive conclusions from by-elections, because it's a sliver of what you're going to see happening at a national level. But there is a residual loyalty to the ANC. And Leanne, I think that our problem in local government elections will be the greater challenge that we face as young voters, whether those young people will register and whether people will not simply have a voter apathy and not register, not vote. And that is a greater problem because it says something about our democratic trajectory and people's buying into democracy and the credibility of the process.
All right, we leave it there. Thank you. There was so much more I wanted to talk to you about, but touching, I think, on the themes that are so well put there in your article and many articles subsequently. That's, of course, Judith February, lawyer, governance specialist, and a columnist commentating about the connection between the well-being of the ANC and, of course, the predicament that puts the country and the running of the state. That's where we leave it for you this morning. Thank you very, very much for watching. And that wraps up our Africa Day edition of Morning Lights. Kina?
It certainly does. Thank you so much for being with us.